Yikes. Oil painting is extremely expensive, as you may have noticed. Sometimes you'll go into an art shop and you'll see this beautiful wall with all these beautiful colours everywhere, and you won't know what to pick. And your first reaction will be, oh, I'll just pick up all the colours that look nice, they look useful, they look pretty, I could use that. But then you get home and you end up with a pile of paints like this, and you'll find that most of them you won't even touch, or you might touch them once or twice, but then you'll end up using the same colours over and over again, and the other paints that you've just spent a fortune on will sit there for years and years and years, and you'll hardly ever touch them. So today I'm going to go through these paints and show you which ones I actually use when I paint. So first things first, let's just go through and get rid of some of these colours that I almost never use. One of them, this one, is some kind of yellow. I think it's called Brilliant Yellow. I've almost never used it. This violet, again, I thought it would be handy, but I've barely ever used it. I've only used it occasionally. This one, Raw Umber, it comes up in a lot of YouTube tutorials about colours, and people often list it in their palette, but I don't think I've used it once, and this was in my very first batch of oil paints I bought about 2 years ago. Let's have a look. Lemon, Windsor Lemon. I have, as you can see, I have used this one, but this was again in my very first batch of oil paints, and I have finished the tube, but again, haven't used it in a long time. Burnt Umber, this one again comes up in a lot of tutorials, and I have used some of it, but I almost never use this one anymore. This is another colour that comes up a lot, Quinacridone Magenta. I do use it sometimes, but very rarely now. Mars Black. This colour I almost never use. I'll go into why I almost never use this colour in a moment, but I found it handy to have it, but you'll find that in almost every palette you can mix your own black, and it looks a lot nicer. I do still have it because I've occasionally had to use it for whatever reason, but it's not something I use very much. You can definitely dispense with that. These other colours I do use, but I'm just going to move them away for now, and I'll leave you with the colours that I use on every palette pretty much. So this is it. Out of all those paints, there would be, I would say, $200 to $300 worth of paints in there. These ones here I use basically for everything. And here we go. So this one would be the one I use the least often out of all of them. It's cadmium yellow. I do use it sometimes just because it depends on what kind of yellow you want to use. So I will invariably end up using it eventually in some small amount, but it would be the least often used out of all these 5 here. This is yellow oxide. This is my favorite yellow. The reason it's my favorite yellow is because if you're mixing sort of natural greens or natural sort of earthy yellows, you'll end up using something more like this just because it looks a lot more natural. And if you use something like cadmium yellow, you'll end up with a really synthetic looking, kind of fake looking yellow that looks like it's been manufactured or not natural, so you won't end up using it as much. Whereas this yellow looks a lot more natural, especially if you're painting landscapes or faces, because it just looks much more natural. So this one I use a lot. As you probably know, almost every palette has red, yellow and blue in it. So I do have a red here. This is Windsor red, which is kind of, I guess, similar to cadmium red in most ways. So this is just the red that I use as a default. You'll always need to use some red. Again, this is my first ever tube of red. So even though I do use it almost every time, I will use the tiniest amount, and I will probably only dip my brush into it once or twice. I do use it, but in very small quantities. So that's why this tiny tube is still probably not even half finished after about 2 years of using it. Now, these three would be my favorite colors, and what you will probably find out after a while are the most important colors you will ever need to use. This is burnt sienna. I use this on every single canvas. The first thing I do when I paint is I will do a thin coat of this color right over the canvas. Why do I do that? Firstly, it just kills the white. It just puts a nice neutral brown color on the background so it doesn't look white and it's not glaring at you. I also like using it because the fact that it's quite warm. It's burnt sienna is sort of like a reddish earthy brown. It's basically, if you have that as your background color, if you paint something like blue over the top, you'll see through the blue and you'll see the brown, and it will make the blue look more vibrant and natural. This is the other color that I'll use in almost every painting. This tube looks like it's not been touched, but that's because this will be my third or fourth tube that I've gone through like this size. This is ultramarine blue, my absolute favorite color. It's a beautiful warmish kind of blue, and I'll be using this for basically sky, water, waves, anything, and just as like a primary color mix in almost every palette. And then at the very end, I have the number one, which is not a color at all. It's white. This is titanium white, which I will use as my lightning sort of method for almost any color that I mix. Again, this would be like several tubes down that I've used this size tube. I go through white a lot. I would put a 20-cent coin sized dollop of white on every palette, and I'll almost always use it straight away. So these will be my colors. One of the colors I like to use, not as often, but I do like it, is, you can't see this because it's got a hole in it, it's Prussian blue. This is sort of one of my favorite colors for painting seascapes, sort of, because I find that it ends up quite... Another one that I've started using, this is my most recent tube that I've bought, is Cobalt Teal. Again, only use tiny bits of this occasionally, and I do find it's quite nice for using sparingly in seascapes because of that beautiful natural kind of turquoise color. It's really lovely. Also in Crimson. I'll use this more in portrait paintings, and the reason I'll use this red instead of a Winsor Newton red is because this red here, this is a very warm red, so it's very bright, so you'll end up using more of a warm color in shadow areas. But then if you have more of a pink or orange in the skin tones, in highlight you'll need more of a cooler red. So although there are ways you can make this cooler, I will go straight for this red because it's a cooler red, and if you lighten this with a little bit of white, you'll find that it looks so much more natural than if you were to lighten this red. This will just look like a really crazy pink, whereas this one will look more like a very subtle pink, and it looks much more natural and much more realistic. So I'll use this much more in my portraits. One more color that I will add here to my sort of semi-useful colors is Quinacridone Magenta. So I hope you found that useful. These are basically my colors. If I could go back to when I was first investing in my art supplies and wanted to purchase the best paints and save the most amount of money, I probably would have just bought these ones. Some of them not quite necessary, but nonetheless worth the investment. But these colors right here, I think I could manage quite well just owning those, and I don't think I would even really need the other ones, because once you get more into learning how to mix colors yourself, you realize more and more that you don't need the color to come out of the tube. You can actually rely on your own skills to mix these colors yourself, and it's a lot more economical, especially because some of these tubes can cost an absolute fortune.